Hello, this is James D'Angelo, and welcome to the Bitcoin 101 Blackboard series. Today, we're going to be introducing something that we've been working on for a number of months, and it's called Snowcaps, or the People's Cap and Trade. And really what it is it's pitting Bitcoin's public ledger versus this enormous problem, this really tough, intractable problem called the tragedy of the commons. And this is a personal journey. It's something I've been very close to for a good chunk of my life. And because of that, I'm going to rewind and talk about when I first learned about tragedy of the commons, which happened to be in university. But ironically, it wasn't in class. I first learned about TOC, tragedy of the commons, in my frat house because our kitchen looked exactly like this one right here. And so what exactly is tragedy of the commons? Well, if you put 15 guys in one house all sharing rent, problems immediately start to arise in the common areas, the kitchens, the living rooms, and in particular, your frat house bathrooms. And this is just a very mild example of people writing notes because the toilet paper was always gone. And so you might look up TOC in the dictionary or Wikipedia. We thought it would be important to look at the definition of just one particular case, and this is the tragedy of the frat house bathroom. Okay, and this is an economics theory according to which frat boys, too busy with their homework and partying, behave in such a way that no one on earth would want to use their bathroom. It was such a TOFHB that none of the sophomores could even shower at home. Too disgusting, too dirty, and anything you left in the shower would immediately get stolen. And if you read deeper, you find that TOC happens elsewhere as well. It's a big problem with email and spamming, Wikipedia falsehoods, vandalism, office refrigerators, both in terms of cleanliness and stealing, clogged highways, etc., etc. Remember, it's just a big problem of commonalities, common spaces, things that everyone can use. But our example talks about the frat house. So let's talk about exactly what was going on in that frat house. Because of TOC, housemates immediately started getting angry at each other, pointing fingers and making signs that looked a lot like this. Sadly, your mother doesn't work here, so clean up your own mess. And we all know the result of putting up signs like this. It does nothing. They don't work. And so immediately you had a situation where between 15 guys, trust had started to erode. Okay, so housemates hid their toilet paper and food. They locked their doors because they were hiding stuff in there. They stole things when they went into the bathroom because things were stolen from them. And they started to actually not be able to use certain areas of the house. So they had to eat in restaurants and shower in gyms. And here's another little sign, do not use. I spit in this and someone keeps using it. Thanks. Well, we know what happened. Someone turned around and used it, or they peed in it. Pretty disgusting stuff as things start to erode. And every time you talk about this with people, you still get this big BS, which is that you can make a difference. Well, if you just started to clean up, others would see what you're doing, respect that, and start to clean up themselves. And that's just not true. No matter how many signs you make, no matter how much cleaning you do, you cannot make a difference in a frat house. And what really happens is, as the dirtier housemates harden from all the finger pointing and the anger, the cleaner housemates start to evolve. And this became the new me. Okay, so you become this pig where you're just dropping your pizza everywhere, you got your laundry over here. And indeed, because of common spaces and the mess in common spaces, you become worse than if you were living alone. And so after graduation, I often worked as a conservationist. So here I am in Gabon. This is elephant poop over here. This is a three-toed sloth here who got dropped off at our camp that we were trying to return to the wild. And one thing that was for sure is that the work involved lots and lots of rivers. So here's the Amazon River. Here's actually the beginnings of the Amazon River in the Andes in Peru. And as a result of working a lot with rivers, you see a lot of TOC. As we know, it wasn't so long ago, definitely this century, when rivers were still magical, adventurous places. Mark Twain based Huckleberry Finn in the rivers. Kids would go swimming all the time in the rivers. People spent their lives in and around rivers. And indeed, at that time, these rivers seemed infinitely clean. There seemed no way to mess up this river paradise. But as we know, things have changed, and this is a little video right here in Kathmandu, Nepal. And it's pretty painful to watch. But we see that we've treated our rivers in the last 100 years like we treat our frat house bathrooms. And this isn't something that just happens in Nepal, okay? So here's the Mississippi River. But right here in Boston, we've got the Charles River, which they're trying to clean up desperately, but is still very, very polluted. And what we see here is all the types of pollutants that are being dumped into the river. So here's a factory, here's toilets, septic tanks, here's fertilizers being spilled into the river, animal waste, chickens and pigs. Here's the runoff from automobiles, especially when it rains. And here's the refineries down in the Gulf Coast. And so there's really no great surprise that when you get down to the end of the river into the Gulf of Mexico, the fish aren't doing so well, and neither is the fishing. But what's important to understand is there's a real tragedy here because you have a dilemma. If you're actually working on the river, and say you're this factory right here, and you decide to do something really good with your waste, you decide instead of dumping it into the Mississippi that you're going to put it through some sort of plant and clean it up, and then you're going to reuse that water. Well, the trouble with that is that's expensive. Okay, so now if you're the only factory doing it, you're now going to be at a competitive disadvantage to your neighbors who now have the advantage of not having to pay for treating their waste. And this is the heart of the problem. If you decide to do the right thing, you'll find yourself having to charge more for your services than any of your competitors along the river. And that is where the real tragedy comes in. And so if you're in a frat house or if you're working on a river, pointing blame is easy, trust begins to erode, and anger increases. You start playing this big blame game. And so for me, I saw this very clearly. Working as a local environmentalist, I started to see some problems with what I was doing. If I was spending my day trying to prevent poaching of gorillas or trying to prevent invasive species from ruining the jungle, but with climate change, global climate change, there was the possibility that all of Gabon, which is now a forest, would end up in short order looking a bit like the Etosha Pan in Namibia. And here's me on my computer actually thinking about that. I got very scared. And so we live in a world of strange ironies brought on by this tragedy of the commons. You have tragedy of the local common, right? The tragedy of the frat house bathroom. And you see how it's almost like a big fractal. The small problem and the big problem are exactly the same. First, I'll clean my bathroom and then I'll take care of the earth. Yeah, right. We know that's not going to happen. And so when you start to consider things like global climate change, you've really got the same problem. Tragedy of frat house bathroom times 1 billion, 2 billion, who knows what, times a lot. Really big problem multiplied by really big numbers and growing. Okay, and so we've all seen these images. Global carbon emissions, 1751 to 2014, we sort of see it taking off during the Industrial Revolution and then increasing exponentially into modern times. And indeed, exponential, anytime we see something exponential these days, here's the growth of Facebook or the growth of Google or growth of any of these big tech firms, anytime we see this sort of exponential thing, we realize that there is sort of an exponential growth to tech, especially with this capitalism meeting technology. And so here we have growth of electricity usage. Here's the growth of the telephone, the refrigerator, the stove, the radio, the car, clothes washer, clothes dryer, air conditioning, color TV, computer. These are years down here is 1960, 1945. And we see that these are all growths that are exponential. And the interesting thing about all of them, each one of them, is that they put out a lot of CO2. So if you really doubt that it's human created, all you have to do is look at the things that produce CO2 and see their exponential growth. Here's the cell phone, VCR, and here's the internet, which actually uses up a lot of electricity, all the drives turning at Google and all these search engines, etc. And so growth is often exponential. Tech growth in particular is often exponential. And so you go around and do your thing because you care. You start lowering your carbon footprint. You drive less, take public transportation, use less gasoline, do all this stuff. And what do you see? Well, you actually see that the destruction is continuing, and it's continuing exponentially. Your individual work is not even a blip on this growth curve. And you start to realize that the biggest BS ever when it comes to frat houses is actually the biggest BS ever when it comes to global climate change. You cannot individually make a difference. It just doesn't work. And what really happens is you end up paying extra. To be more environmental, oftentimes it means you have to process your waste. You have to do extra things or avoid certain things. And so you end up paying the cost. And the question is, Will you go broke while everybody who's exploiting the environment is running off with the bags of cash? And so, just like the frat boys getting angry at each other, you got people getting angry and scared, pointing fingers at governments, yelling left and right. You got the Democrats drawing cartoons, making fun of the Republicans. But does all that finger pointing make people better? Well, actually it doesn't. So it sort of leads to entrenchment of ideas. It leads to conservatism of what you're being made fun of for. And we've seen that through time. So here are polled Republicans' beliefs that climate change is really a problem, that it's really occurring. And over time, so here's 2008, 2007, so that's probably like 1990s, you can see that it's gone down. Okay, so they've entrenched in their ideas, while Democrats have gone up somewhat. And this is a real tragedy. This is the tragedy of the commons. You see some groups hardening and other groups are changing. But what's interesting here is that Republicans have given us the strongest practical tool to fight climate change, and that is cap and trade. And this goes back to the 90s. So George Bush Sr. proposed and signed a cap and trade bill in 1990. And the amazing thing about it is it really, really worked. And the big problem then was sulfur dioxide, which was causing acid rain. And here you can see the signing of this bill and the reduction of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Worked gangbusters, okay? And as a result, cap and trade has become the centerpiece of all environmental negotiations. So if you look at what they were proposing, Kyoto or Copenhagen, it's all about developing some form of global cap and trade where you actually cap or limit the amount of carbon that each country can produce, and you can start to trade the ability to emit carbon or pollute between the different countries, realistically creating a tradable value around emissions. And this is just such a great idea. Unfortunately, that's where the good news ends. Ever since 1990, lots of problems have started to come out based on cap and trade. Okay, cap and trade has proven costly in two main ways. One is it's expensive to regulate. So you've got to send out all these regulators to go about and measure the amount of carbon that's being produced. So that's fairly expensive, especially for governments who don't do that thing very well. But it also creates the same idea that we were talking about. If certain countries do not sign on for the cap and trade, then it becomes expensive for your country to be doing a cap and trade when the other countries are not. So if you're limiting your emissions and they're not, you find yourself in a disadvantaged situation. So you get a competitive disadvantage. And so we see here, when we're trying to recover from this big economic meltdown of 2007, 2008, well, the last thing anybody wants to hear is sort of this new expense of building a cap and trade program. And this is really what we just said. Countries which adopt end up with an added expense, and as a result, they could be the ones that go broke while the other countries start doing really well, because it's just plain cheaper not to pay for your pollution. And so in all these environmental accords at Kyoto, Copenhagen, there's lots of anger. People pointing fingers, it becomes political, it becomes divisive. You've got the USA pointing their fingers at China. You have the citizens of the US getting angry at the American government, Chinese angry at the Chinese government, and every possible combination in the middle. Big tragedy of the commons, a big blame game. And as we saw in the chart, Republicans have begun stepping back from anything to do with cap and trade and really anything to do with climate change. But are they wrong? And this cartoon here shows how much should the government commit to stopping climate change? And the big Republican guy over here says, I'm a big fan of unrestricted and free. Free meaning two things here, but possibly the idea that he doesn't want to pay for a cap and trade program. And that's why this little character down here calls him a cheapskate. And so we can see the big problem here, because climatologists, learning from the beautiful success of 1990 with George Bush, they've really grown to love this enormous top-down solution. George Bush just signs a little piece of paper, and they've got their cap and trade. The big government comes in and tells everybody that if they pollute, they're going to have to pay for it. I will cap and you will trade. And here's big business over here, and we don't even see the people because they're not involved. The climatologist solution to public policy. And this is what climatologists have been doing since 1990. They've been following that same road, hoping for the same result. And as we've seen with the belief chart spreading, it's not looking as immediately obvious that that's going to happen anytime soon. But what's interesting is that there's even bigger fundamental problems with how this is done. If the government is forming a free market, well, that's kind of an irony in itself. The government controlling the market makes it not free in general. And so the cap and trades that we hear about all the time kind of exist on a trapeze above the people's heads. You have the big government way up at top, passing down the options to trade carbon to the big polluters, really the big companies. And there's no people involved in this trade at all. So they formed a cartel above the heads of the voters, and you begin to see the problem with that, right? Individuals cannot go online and start trading their own carbon emissions. By law, they're left out entirely, okay? So here's the government telling them to stop trading. We are the free market, the government, and sort of the irony of it all is that they're upset having these little petty people involved in their project. But what they found is that if you leave the voters out, if really the only thing you're offering to voters is belt tightening, basically more expenses, they're going to get disenchanted with your cap and trade. And this is a big problem because, as we know, the strongest social force in history are incentivized masses. Okay, so if the people can all profit or get involved in the market economy, we find that it changes everything. So here's this kind of humorous picture of a highway in North Korea, and here's one in South Korea. And if you're an environmentalist, well, this is the one that terrifies you. But what is really shown in this drawing is how incentivized people get out and actually do something and can change the way the world works. So you can sort of think of this as the current cap and trade schemes are over here. This one here is isolating all the people from being involved. No people can actually trade here, and you can sort of see the benefits if you can somehow allow the people to start trading the carbon themselves. So when we look at the old way of doing it, we see that we've got a lot of disenfranchised voters, and as a result, all ideas of cap and trade seem to be falling apart. And that's not good. Okay, so now that we've set up all these problems, we have now come to our mission. We need something that we can launch ASAP. Carbon emissions are not going away, they're increasing exponentially. We love the idea of cap and trade, but we want a truly free market, so no cartels. Small groups make for bad markets. We want something that is available to everyone on Earth. And we don't want to have to beg and plead with our cheap and fickle governments. It's not only not wrong to want a smaller government, it's unrealistic to think that the separation of beliefs is suddenly going to coalesce and everyone's going to want a huge governmental approach to carbon emissions. It just seems unlikely. And because of all the troubles with fairness in the big international accords, we want to come up with something that is fair. If we can come up with something that is unarguably fair, even better, because all the arguing is really part of the tragedy. Whatever we do clearly must have real regulation. So if some party is abusing the limits or caps that are in place, there must be some global recourse in the system to those who are abusing the caps and limits of carbon emissions. And finally, and most importantly, we want to fight back against the tragedy of the commons. And we believe the way to do this is through the strongest social force in history, incentivize masses. And this has everything to do with ownership. If we can insert ownership into the problem of carbon emissions, we can change the game. And fortunately, this is now possible. It's not a sure thing, but it's now possible. And this is only possible because of the 2009 launching of Bitcoin with its beautiful public ledgers. So with no further ado, we propose a new idea, a new approach. And we call it snow caps, and it's the people's cap and trade. And here's the little elevator pitch. Using public ledgers, Bitcoin's public ledger, we can launch a global cap and trade today that sidesteps government and gives equal shares of carbon emissions to everyone on Earth. And it's important when you deal with such a big idea to start looking immediately at the difficulties of building such a project. And one of the first is, say you launched a market today, and you gave everybody on Earth equal shares. Well, the price is going to be next to nothing or nothing at the beginning, and some big adventurous capitalist could see the benefit in this and go and buy up all the shares. So here's a fish who ate all the other fish in the pond. Then they would control the entire market for the emissions. So you really don't have a good market. So this whole idea of early market manipulation is a problem, but you've also created the same problem. If they buy all the shares, everyone's sold for next to nothing, you end up with all disenfranchised people. They're no longer excited about the idea at all. So this is difficulty number 1 of 4. And our solution to this is something that you could have never done before Bitcoin's public ledgers. We're going to make ownership lifelong. and all carbon emissions will be loaned to the big polluters. So here's the big companies over here, and here's the individual citizen with lots of carbon emission rights over here. And in our system, you can never completely sell your rights. You will always be able to pull your lease back at any time and release it to someone else. So if you've entered into a lease contract with Walmart and you want to switch it to Whole Foods, you can do that at your beck and call. You are the landlord of your specific rights. So you have lifelong rights. Very big change to how things are done, and only possible because of Bitcoin's public ledger. And so what you really end up with is a cap and lease and not a cap and trade. And individuals are now given atmospheric ownership, which is an idea that's been talked about for a while, but it's never seemed realistic to do. Governments didn't know how to deal with enormous amounts of leases. And so you make the individuals, the citizens, these Earth's new landlords. And this is key because, as we know throughout history, ownership changes everything. If you can give people individual ownership in a specific market, then that market changes entirely. We've seen that with patent ownership. So with pharmaceuticals or anything else you can make a patent of. The amount that drives invention is just phenomenal. People are going in for themselves, and as a result end up making products that help the rest of the world. We saw it also with Magna Carta, which in clause 39 suggests that people have rights to their own property. There's no question that the ideas of this created the Industrial Revolution, fomented all of the growth of England, made England this enormous power, just by simply providing individual ownership. But what I think is actually one of the more interesting ones, and since I've sold a lot of music in my life, is this idea of music ownership. If you write a song today, your rights in the United States will stay with you for 75 years after your death. So just like what we're proposing, you get a lifelong ownership. And with music, you actually get 75 more years. So your family will profit off of your song 75 years after you die. Music is also very similar because it's very hard to track. You play music in a bar, you play music in a club, and the bars and clubs actually pay for that. It's not something they want to do. They hate paying for it, and the bills are fairly high. So we see a lot of stories about this. And it isn't the government that goes in and makes them pay for the music. It's actually two big companies that you might have heard of. You have BMI and ASCAP, and these guys are the music police. These are third-party organizations who chase down every single one of my songs on every radio, every club, everywhere on Earth. And I get a statement every few months showing me where that's played. Very similar to carbon. It can happen everywhere, and very similar to carbon. They're counting it and tracking it and billing the individual companies for it. Again, this isn't a government program. Government will support it simply by the fact that it agrees that you have those rights, these 75 years, which are arbitrary. These are arbitrary things creating real wealth and creating real individual incentive to produce music and control those musical rights. So as we try to develop ownership, it's key to see that it's not unique. This is a very key idea throughout history and has been ignored recently as climatologists are looking to cap carbon. It's something that needs to come back. And again, as we mentioned, before Bitcoin, it was absolutely impossible to do. Imagine forming a government branch to track ownership of 7 billion people on Earth and all their ownerships and leases of carbon and all of it bouncing back whenever they want. That program itself would be trillions and trillions of dollars, just impossible. But public ledgers, which came out with Bitcoin in 2009, are the ideal solution for providing something like this. One private key, so this user has one private key, is all that's needed for him to make thousands and thousands of leases. And he can go around and change his private key and lease out again and again and again. He or she will always have ownership of his private key, and he or she will always have the ability to pull those leases back. Nothing like this has ever existed before. And if we start thinking about the cost of setting something like this up, it turns out to be ridiculous. There's companies already out that provide this service for free. What, you want 7 billion lease contracts? Oh, well, you just set it right up. There's a very small transaction fee on each transaction, and blammo, you've got the whole system, leases settling itself, paying out to the right person, all working autonomously. And you can do this today with Counterparty. Mastercoin is talking about it. Another company called Ethereum is supposed to come out in a few months, all based on these smart contracts. And computers are very good at taking one idea of maybe one contract and multiplying it by billions and handling it with no problem. Contracts, it turns out, are very easy for computers to negotiate. Okay, so we stepped into difficulty number 2, and these are major difficulties. The last one, we kind of solvable. This one, we're not so sure about, right? Signing up the entire world isn't easy. Right now, we've got 7 billion plus people on Earth, but the big problem is not all of them even have IDs. So here's a recent article, just came out a couple days ago, about 220 million children on Earth who don't exist. What it means is they don't have any IDs. And growing up for them is very tough in these countries because a lot of high schools and schools require you to have some sort of identification to get inside the system, but the systems are so bureaucratic, corrupt, etc., that it's very hard for them to get IDs. Fortunately, there's a really big push to change this. So we're trying to give the world access to IDs. Now, you don't need to have an ID if you don't want one. If you just don't want to exist on Earth, you could probably get away with that. But if you want an ID and you want to become part of a global citizen, of a global economy, etc., this option should be available to you. So we see more and more people entering into the economy, having an online presence via Facebook. Facebook's now got 2 billion registered users and growing. But we've also seen companies like Circle now start to look at this as a possibility as well. They haven't even launched yet, but they're talking about trying to incorporate the world's citizens into a financial system. And this company has a lot of financial backing, and hopefully they're going to take on leading the charge into this abyss. But what's clear is that you can start to build the system with the people who've got IDs, you can get people registered as much as possible, and over time, a system like a cap and lease can grow as people get involved in the system. And as soon as they get involved, well, they can lease at the same rate that everybody else on Earth is leasing at. So it gives them an incentive, a financial incentive, to actually get their identifications. So this might be a nice thing for them. So now we're hit with difficulty number 3. And this is a problem, right? If network effects take time, any big network, Facebook, Google, Bitcoin itself, takes a number of years before it develops to a point where it's really changing the way things are working on Earth. And so a system like SNOWCAPS would likely take a minimum of 5 years before it really starts dropping carbon in any significant way at all. That would be the hope. And the trouble is, those 5 years we're losing. So we're actually polluting like crazy. We're putting up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which stays up there for 1,000 years. And so we're going to be paying the price for that time. So we're left with a situation of sort of the rabbit, which is Congress. They could come down tomorrow and slap on a cap and trade. They could provide amazing regulation tomorrow. Or our system, which is sort of the tortoise solution, which would take a while, 5 years, maybe longer. The only good news about this is it doesn't seem immediately obvious that Congress is going to be doing anything in the next 5 years. We've gotten close to producing some legislation, but Congress has known about global climate change. They've known about carbon emissions for 30 to 50 years. And the inaction there just continues. We're not close to having any major policy today, but remember, there's also issues with these enormous top-down approaches anyways. They leave the people out. Okay, so these systems that we're kind of hoping for are imperfect at best as they are. We might be better off with letting a system grow and build sort of as a grassroots, and then letting government come in at the end. It's always nice to have some help from all parties involved, government included. When government comes in at the end and not at the beginning, it often is much stronger. The legislation is better, the regulation is better, and the support is more effective. So it might behoove us to actually let the network build, which incentivizes voters, which incentivizes Congress, and letting government come in much stronger at the very end. Okay, so we've looked at 3 of the 4 major problems. This last one is the real problem. This is the real monster problem right here, the biggest of them all. And it has to do with regulation. Public ledgers have no police. Public ledgers just exist on computers. They don't have any regulation. They don't have any strong arm to go about and make sure that what you claim to be trading, selling, or whatever on your public ledger is actually happening. So, as it says here, public ledgers have no police. Well, Congress has the ability to pull the strings of police, to actually move manpower to get things done. And this is why climatologists love Congress, right? Congress can just be this big bully and beat these people up and say, this is what happens when you don't pay for your carbon emissions. And so without regulation, well, it's game over. You don't have a cap and trade. You have just a trade. You have no real cap. You haven't really stopped anything. So we're really in search of a new idea or a new force to change the way things work. So here's the old problem. So we really need a new POW, a real whammy. And it would be nice if the thing we're looking at has already been shown to work on some level. And indeed, the thing we're going to talk about has worked already on a number of massive online sites, and it works quite well. So what we're talking about is regulation by reputation. So if we go back to the previous slide, all of these sites have some form of policing done by reputation itself. eBay is a great example, where if you're selling a product on eBay or buying a product, you look very carefully at how many positive reviews and positive feedback they have, and you're unlikely to make a purchase or a sale unless you're looking on the order of 90% or above. Because anything less than that, you start to see there's some risk. This is true with the selling on Amazon and even the reviews on Amazon. This is true with YouTube, where people will only watch videos if they've got enough thumbs up or enough view counts or etc. And the same is true with Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And so we've really seen a modern revolution of regulation by reputation, such that the business world has really taken note. Here's an article, 6 Steps to Managing Your Online Reputation, which can be really damaging for a company. So if your restaurant is on Yelp and you've got lots of bad reviews, you're going to find your customer base is dropping. And here's a little joke down here. Where do you hide a dead body? Answer, on the 3rd page of Google results. Basically referring to the fact that most people will find their search in the 1st page or 2, and rarely do they even go to the 3rd. So they usually have figured out what they're looking for in the first couple pages. If your bad news is on the 3rd page, well, that's probably okay. But if they type in your company's name and it's there on the 1st page, you're in trouble. So a Google search can be your best friend or your worst enemy. And we've seen this really come into play with more and more newer companies where they're really relying on this reputation to insert an online presence into things that had no online presence before. So here's negotiating hotel rooms in individual people's houses. Something that seemed so sketchy 10 years ago is now become so big that Airbnb is valued at billions and billions of dollars. The same is true with Uber. You can walk out in the airport and some person in a regular car will pick you up. All these things we used to be really afraid of are regulated by online reputation schemes. And so if we think about something like carbon emissions, right? If a company or a product is being made with sort of sloppy carbon emission standards, we could start to see responses from other companies. So Whole Foods will not buy your product if it's got certain ingredients. And in fact, 54% of the food sold at Walmart, you will never see at Whole Foods because of their rules and regulations based on information they have on that product. And these are very powerful market driving features, as we've seen Whole Foods has really grown to a powerful market force in the last dozen years. So this is a really important thing, this ability to regulate by reputation. It's a major sea change with how humans are interacting on Earth and how products are being delivered and sold. So there's a chance that we might be able to do some regulation of carbon emissions just by dealing with this very modern concept of online reputations. And so as we've already looked at the 4 major difficulties with coming up with such a scheme, let's look at some of the advantages that would really help drive sort of the market adoption or the user adoption of such a cap and lease, cap and trade scheme. So these are the big advantages of snow caps. And we're just going to run through this list today. In our next video, we'll go into detail each of these individual advantages, highlighting exactly how they could work to build the massive global adoption that is required for building a carbon emissions cap and trade. Okay, so remember, snow caps incentivizes the masses. Each person on Earth could end up profiting by leasing their own rights, their atmospheric rights of carbon emissions. So you're actually giving every individual on Earth the chance to profit. That's a fairly big incentive. And we've already spoke how we're going to at least start by using a modern approach to regulation, this idea of reputation. We've also mentioned how inexpensive this could be. Remember, if we're running this contractual system on Bitcoin's public ledger, well, the expense of running the system is just the initial programming. It's important to realize that Bitcoin was also launched for free. Okay, so this possible rewriting of all international finance is just humming along by itself, and it's incentivizing many, many people. So it produces incentives that also was very inexpensive to launch, likely launched by one person who just pressed go on his computer. We're hoping to do a similar thing with snow caps. And so as a result, we can launch today or as soon as the software gets done. The key here is there's no need to wait for Congress. There's no need to create new science or make more insulting cartoons for the skeptics to change, because they're not going to change. They're hardened. The only way they're going to change is if they start to see something working or if they're incentivized to join in the system. So no waiting for Congress really means no waiting for all the skeptics, the Koch brothers, etc. So we can do it for very cheap, and we can launch without having to convince everybody everybody to jump on at the beginning. Okay, so the next one. Inside of the system, we have two powerful feedback loops which drive adoption, which we'll talk about in the next video, and regulation. So we'll get new forms of regulation, not just the regulation form here, and we'll get new forms of adoption that are not just based on the initial incentives to the masses. All right, so these things can be accelerated by feedback loops, which drive capitalism and all the exponentially up functions that we've been talking about. Wouldn't it be great if we could use an exponential function to drive carbon emissions down? And that's what we're looking at here. Another thing that's very, very important if you're going to launch a cap and trade scheme is that it be transparent. A lot of countries and a lot of individuals in every country are very skeptical. Okay, so they're going to want to tear down your system. But if you could show that your system is fully transparent, well, you're going to eliminate a lot of that skepticism. And the beautiful thing of a Bitcoin public ledger that has never existed before is 100% transparency. You're going to look in and be able to see every transaction. You'll be able to float a penny inside the system and you'll be able to track it. That's transparent. Fully transparent really, really helps with global adoption because of all the cynics and all the critics and all the naysayers. They're going to be able to analyze the data. They're going to be able to make moves themselves and see those moves happening inside the system. 100% transparent. And we've touched upon it already, but this is a very, very important thing, is that our system is fully voluntary. Okay, so Congress isn't coming down and forcing you to do it. You are choosing to sign in. Clearly, there's some big advantages of voluntary over forced. So if people do come in because of all the incentives that they get, they're going to be much more positive than if the government's coming around with regulators telling them exactly what they need to be doing and how much they need to be paying with no incentives but belt tightening for them. The other thing that's really key, and we barely touched on, is that one of the big troubles with Kyoto and Copenhagen is this idea of fairness. Should this country do more? Should this country do less? This country's been developing and polluting for a long time, so maybe we should let the others catch up. Big, big issues of fairness. And part of this is because they're drawing political lines and geographic lines. Our system tackles this from the opposite angle. We offer equal access to every citizen on Earth. That's a form of fairness that's pretty hard to argue. So every individual in the system that can sign on, clearly there's some issues with internet access and ID access and all that stuff right now, will have equal abilities in the system to benefit. So very fair. Everyone gets a share or everyone gets 10 shares. It's just an equal amount of shares. And another really important advantage is by actually putting a cap and trade out there that anyone can use, you are providing an option where in most places there is no option. If you're living in most places in the United States, there is no cap and trade in your area. There is nothing even close to being announced. If you're living in most countries on Earth, there is no cap and trade. So if you're a government, now all of a sudden you'll have not only the option of choosing this one, but you'll be able to look at it and maybe model it and develop your own, or you'll have the ability to say, well, I didn't design it, so you have some plausible denial, but we're going to use it, so that you aren't responsible for all the fairness issues and all of that. So for some government people, it's better to have systems they can just sign on to that are already built, that aren't perfect, than sort of arguing all the time about what fairness is. And these things get really, really complex. And in these conventions with all the countries and all these political leaders, the documents just grow, and the systems become so convoluted and complex that people just don't know what they're talking about anymore. Because we're designing the system based on one user, one share, it's as simple as it gets. It's very easy to understand, but it provides an option for anybody out there who is looking to get involved in a cap and trade. Sign on, start trading, and have some fun. Okay, so that's all we're going to cover in this first part. The next part, we're going to actually go through each one of these individually and really look at how they could spur adoption and really start lowering carbon emissions on Earth. This would be great. Without Bitcoin, it would be absolutely impossible. So public ledgers have changed the game. And we're just hoping to apply it to this really intractable problem of frat house bathrooms, the tragedy of the commons. And the beauty is carbon is countable, so we can see how we're doing, we can see how individual companies are doing, we can see how individuals are doing. And so as a result, it is an ideal thing to actually trade, and if you can cap it, people will definitely trade. Okay, so before we go, we normally say please like, comment, subscribe, etc. on YouTube. That would be great. Do all of that. But there's something more important you can do right now. We were kind of late in the game to this great MIT Climate Collab Challenge, and we're going to post the link below. But if you really like this sort of idea, if you really see the blockchain being able to tackle carbon emissions, or at least give it a shot because it's so inexpensive, we might as well try, then please sign on here and comment here. And if you do like, please go over here. Because right now, even though we came in late, we're number 2 of about 40 submissions. We'd love to get to the point where we're really getting recognized. There's not a lot of prize money here, but there is some recognition and some help with developing a program like this. And though something like this is fairly easy to code, it would still take a bit of work, it needs some attention at the beginning to really get the ball rolling. And it would be really great to get that attention. So again, like, comment, subscribe, but we're going to post the link to the Climate Collab, which will look something like this. Please click over there and do what you can over here. And again, if your comments aren't positive, that's fine as well. We'd love to hear them here. But if you do enjoy it, we'd love to hear it here. And there is no thumb down. I think there should be some sort of thumb down here. So this is a very positive site. So you really don't have the option. If you do click, you'll click over here. And as we know, Bitcoin comes so far from left field that it takes a lot of people a long time to understand. The same is true with an idea like this. This is so far from left field if you know nothing about public ledgers and their ability to rewrite how we do trading, ownership, and contracts. So even the idea will take a little while to develop, take a little while to settle in, but with a little luck, we might even be able to make an initial launch later this year or early next year, and then let Metcalfe's law sort of climb in. So we'll start maybe a first year with like 1 trade and move up. And if it does move up, well, that would be great because then we can drop CO2 emissions down and we can make the planet a little bit safer for my son, who's now 2.5 years old. Okay, so remember, please like, comment, subscribe, but even more importantly, hop onto this page. You're going to have to log on and give it some support over here or make some comments over here. The People's Cap and Trade MIT Climate Collab Contest. Thanks again, and we'll catch you at our next video.